How fascist came to mean liberty lover. The single most important fight in the war of words now upon us centers on the accusation, fascist. How many times have you or some other person on the right been called that? The F word is increasingly used by social justice warriors to dismiss any deviation from woke norms. I don't think children are capable of deciding to have life-altering surgery that changes their biological sex. Fascist. The idea of allowing people to flood the border bears little resemblance to actual immigration. Fascist. Abortion after the first trimester is clearly murder. Fascist. There is no reason to restrict domestic oil production, as there is no evidence that this contributes to climate change. Fascist. You get the idea. While all the initial statements above are moderate ones, inviting counterpoint and discussion, the repeated rejoinder is an unarguable dismissal. The very word fascist is enough to flatline conversation. And why shouldn't it? What's worse than a jackbooted thug forcing his beliefs on you? That's what fascism is, right? If that is indeed what fascism is, then why is the term not reversed in examples like these to apply to the person yelling fascism? This person is the one forcing his beliefs on the interlocutor, insisting that any thoughts but his are invalid and deserving of social shaming or even arrest. And yet, I have never heard a person on the right, though regularly accused of fascism for statements such as these, return fire with, "No, you're the fascist." And yet, aside from its admitted resemblance to a schoolboy taunt, it would be a perfectly accurate response. Yet something holds us back. What, precisely? You know the answer. What holds us back is the belief that fascism is a product of the right. The usual political spectrum puts communism on the far left, and as we move right, we encounter socialism, then a mixed economy, then capitalism, and finally at the far right of the spectrum, fascism. The further left one goes, the more collectivist one is until at last comes communism, the completely equitable state. On the other hand, a rightward trend takes one eventually to fascism by way of the increasing market freedoms of a mixed economy and capitalism. What? How has anyone ever believed this? Why was this nonsensical idea allowed to circulate? Increasing freedom cannot lead to the total elimination of freedom, represented by the historical regimes of Benito Mussolini and Adolf Hitler. It would be like saying that eating nutritious food leads to poisoning. We need to look at the history of left and right for clues to this insanity. As is well known, the terms did not exist in their political meaning prior to 1789. When members of the French National Assembly, who favored retaining the king's power, sat on the right side of the chamber, while those who opposed the king sat on the left. In the way that words so often become parodies of themselves, the right, because of its association with King Louis XVI, came to indicate authority and order, while the left got to wear the mantle of the French Revolution's two central principles, liberty and equality. Fraternity, the third so-called principle, was added after the fact, so each of the three colors of the new French flag had a matching principle, according to none other than investigator Jacques Derrida. Look up any standard definition of the political right, and you will find prominent mention of authority and tradition, as contrasted with the left, which is said to stand for liberality of thought and economic compassion. This widespread assumption is based on the association of authority and tradition with the king, and the association of liberality with opposition to the king. But it turns out that these associations are false, because the king, while of course representing tradition, stood for something much more significant: freedom. To understand why, we must dig deeper. It was in the 1680s, under King Louis XIV, that Finance Minister Jean-Baptiste Colbert asked a merchant named Legendre what the king might do to help his business. Said Legendre, "Laissez-nous faire. Let us do it, i.e., keep government out of our affairs." The plea was ignored, the reign of Louis XIV being the height of state power in France. But by the mid-18th century, thanks to the more sympathetic King Louis XVI, things had loosened sufficiently that René de Voyer, a free trade advocate, could cite the Legendre story as emblematic of an emerging freedom. That is why the supporters of the king in 1789, the right-sitters, should be viewed as the champions of freedom, while those on the left should be understood as opposing freedom in favor of equality. Equality enforced at the edge of a guillotine blade if necessary. The superficial freedoms of people in the market were not true freedoms, the left said. How could they be when some people wielded power while others did not? It would be necessary from the left point of view to reinstall the authority of the state in pursuit of an enforced equality. The right, on the other hand, viewed freedom as the only true foundation for human endeavor. If equality was to exist at all, it would have to be the sort of equality that issued from the free competition of individuals. They sat on the right not because they favored authority per se, but because they favored the freedoms that had been assured them by the authority of the king. This distinction, which is the true difference between left and right, should have come down to us today essentially intact. To be on the left should mean to favor the enforcement of equality via the state. To be on the right should indicate liberty, the absence of state interference, as the foundation of society. But if the essential difference between left and right comes down to a simple preference for a grounding principle, equality for the left, freedom for the right, how has right come to mean Hitler and state authority and fascism, when all those things mean the opposite of freedom? You will search in vain for a dictionary definition of right wing that identifies the term with freedom. Most link it to the recognition of traditional authority. The closest to the true meaning of favoring freedom over equality is something like preserves the current order, where current order means the United States in its constitutional identity. One wonders at the legitimacy of such a definition when it is used to apply equally to the preservation of oppression. It turns out that for the fatal twist of meaning, we have Joseph Stalin to thank. Stalin and the Bolsheviks saw themselves as heir to the French revolutions, not just the 1789 issue, but all subsequent editions, 1830, 1848, and especially the Paris Commune of 1871. The terms left and right followed the Bolsheviks into power, but with altered meaning. When Stalin faced challenges from within his own party, he divided his opponents into right-wing deviants and left-wing deviants. Socialism as conceived by Stalin was, of course, the center. Too nationalist in their leanings, Stalin placed to his right. Those too demanding of the immediate workers' paradise of pure, stateless communism, he placed to his left. This parodied the original left and right of 1789, but pertained only within the range of socialist theories. Hitler's National Socialists were right-wingers in the context of socialism, and only in that context. Picture socialism as a single political entity with a center of tight state control and a facade of liberality. To its right would be a strictly nationalist approach to rule, as in National Socialism, and to its left, pure communism. Within this Stalinist conception, Nazism was the right wing of socialism. It was, as its name proclaimed, National Socialism, a form of socialism in which the national character of the state is emphasized. When facile dictionary entries point out that Hitler persecuted communists, they fail to add that communist, at the time, referred to the left wing of the very socialism to which Hitler belonged on the right. Nazi politics were not opposed to Stalin's socialist politics. They shared an animus toward the liberal, capitalist West, and both employed collectivist economies oriented to the purported goal of equalizing the status of all its citizens. It was common throughout the 30s to understand Hitler and Stalin as sharing the same political beliefs, evidenced by this excerpt from an editorial in the Pittsburgh Courier of January 2, 1937. The writer is American black nationalist W.E.B. Du Bois. Germany and Russia are the two greatest socialistic states of the modern world, and are pursuing their attack on private business along essentially the same lines. Their commonality was cemented in the Molotov-Ribbentrop Non-Aggression Pact of 1939, in which the Soviet Union agreed to do nothing while Hitler annexed half of Europe and put millions of Jews in concentration camps. They were, after all, fellow socialists in the fight against the liberal West. You will not hear leftists mention this uncomfortable item. Nor will you hear them mention that the only thing that brought the Soviet Union into World War II was Hitler's sudden decision to break the pact in 1941. Stalin was content to keep watching Europe die, but thankfully for history, and for reasons no one can explain, Hitler decided to declare war against his old friend. The war ended with the right wing of socialism defeated and its center victorious. Almost immediately, the term right wing was transposed from a branch of socialism to socialism's enemy. This, of course, was the original 1789 meaning of the right, and the one that should have remained in place, i.e., opposition to the leveling, equalizing power of the state. Opposition, in other words, to leftism in its original meaning. But because of Stalin's misleading redefinition, right now also referred to the oppressive state apparatuses of Nazi Germany and their Italian friend, the Fascist Party. That this oppression had in fact originated in what we should now call the left swiftly got brushed aside, and right came to mean both the advocacy of freedom, its original meaning, and state oppression, its opposite at the same time. Freedom is slavery, goes the saying in 1984. Free speech is oppression, goes the woke mantra of the 2020s. Now we see how such verbal conceptual messes can occur when misused words are allowed to destroy the truth. Right wing, which less than a century ago referred to a branch of socialism, but which a century before that indicated opposition to socialism, is now taken by nearly everyone, not just sneering academics and the fool media commentators who take their clownish selves seriously, but the man or woman in the street, the student, and the voter, to mean both state oppression and the championing of freedom simultaneously. Since right once referred to the Nazis and the fascists, and since quite obviously those guys were evil and oppressive, then the current right must also be evil and oppressive. Their belief in freedom must therefore somehow be tinged with fascism. Likewise, the opposite of right must be good. Communism is far left, therefore it must be the best. This fraudulent association of the political right with fascism and Nazism is a deadly weapon aimed against freedom. The left must not be allowed to get away with it. Shout these people down. They call you fascists, you call them Nazis. One of you will be a lot closer to the truth.